Okay, I would just love to hear where you guys were you guys able to get through all of the terminology up until this point? I know Suha, you might have not been able to just because you weren't here in the last session, so I just want to kind of get a feel for where everyone's at.
I'm on literally like the last couple of words.
Yeah,
I I finished it.
Yeah,
awesome.
I finished it too.
How about you, Suha? How are you feeling on it?
I'm like halfway done. So I plan to finish them like after this meeting.
Yeah, no worries. It's kind of nice just because they're quizzes and videos, so it's not too much
Yeah.
extra work, I feel like, but I'm glad to hear you guys are almost through or all the way through. That's a good place to be just because you guys will be moving into the next section on Wednesday with Tom is his name. So just wanted to let you guys know. I'll kind of recap that at the end. Last time when we left off, Rimsa, you had asked a question to me and it was about non-recourse loans and whether or not, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was whether or not non-recourse means lower interest rates. Is that what you had asked? Okay, so based on that question, it's not necessarily based on like non-recourse means lower interest rates. It's more about the LTV. So there's more of a correlation with non-recourse and the LTV. And it just kind of depends on the type of lender you're going to work with. So whether that be a CMBS lender, a bridge lender, because those typically are non-recourse. And like life insurance companies are usually non-recourse. So it more depends on that. And the interest rate doesn't necessarily have a correlation with that. So I just wanted to recap on that. And if you have any kind of major questions like around, I would say interest rates and a few of these other terms, when you guys are in your session with Tom, and you'll be with him for the next couple sessions, he is specifically a loan associate. So he's kind of on the front end of this, you know, he's been, sorry, let me repreface that. He's been a loan associate, so he's really worked hands-on with finding, you know, right deals for borrowers and stuff. So if there is specific questions I'm not able to answer today, he has a lot of knowledge on the industry. So I would encourage you to keep asking questions and yeah, write those down. And if we don't get a chance to cover them, he will be able to get to those. So where we left off last time.
Wait, sorry, Mackie, I wanted to interrupt you. I know you guys probably went over this last week, but can you, so as I was watching the video, you know how there's like two different types of articles. There's one of incorporation and organization.
Mhm.
I had a question based on that. So since they both help in establishing a corporation, like what's the major difference between them? Like as I was reading them, I know that they both focus, I think one focuses on like LLC, but the other does like similar stuff, like some similar, like handles the same business. So what's like the main difference between them?
Yeah, honestly, that's a great question. So you're looking at the articles of organization and then the articles of incorporation.
Incorporation, yes.
So the articles of organization is usually more of like a one-page document or 1 to 2 page document. It kind of breaks it down into like the entity name, the entity ID, who the mailing address that goes with it, who's like the owner of it. And the articles of incorporation is usually a longer document and it goes into a lot more detail, more legal verbiage. And to be honest, I don't know the exact differences. I do know that you need both documents. Like these are just like legal documents that the government produces through the state that basically shows that if this entity is established through the state or not, and if it's an active, because you know you had to pay to have your you had to pay and you had to go through like a registration process to establish your entity. So it's showing that this entity is active, who owns the entity. So great question. I don't know the specifics on how it's like what makes it different than each other, but I do know both of those documents are just like important to have. And on my end, I'm always asking for like articles of organization, articles of incorporation, and typically it's something that you'll ask the borrower for and they'll be able to like recognize, oh, I need to give them this. It's not something they're typing up. Like they get that from the state when they register as an entity. They get this document that's produced and I'll send it over to the lender. The underwriters will look at it, and they usually have like a legal team that will confirm that. And I don't know what specifications they go to make sure it is, but you can like look up on the Arizona Corporation Commission website, and you can like see for yourself if the entity is active and in good standing. But as far as like actually reading through it, I typically wouldn't necessarily read, me personally wouldn't read through it, because usually there's like a legal team that would read through it themselves. So I know that's not a very direct answer to your question, but
No, but it definitely helped. Thank you.
yeah. So where we left off last time, we kind of were talking about LTVs and LTCs. Does anybody remember what the LTV stands for versus the LTC?
Isn't
I
it
remember that. Oh,
Go for it, Joey.
no, you're all good. You already started.
Isn't it loan to value and then loan to cost?
Yeah, and can anybody kind of give me a recap of what that, like what those terms kind of explain?
Yeah. So loan to value is out of the loan, how much of the total amount for the property that loan is going to give you. And loan to cost, isn't it how much the loan is going to give you of what it's going to cost for you to build that property? So you already have like the land. So like, let's say you need $500,000 to build the property. They're going to give you like 300,000, and that would be a certain percent LTC.
Right, because like with loan to value, they're valuing the property based on like an appraisal, but loan to cost is like a construction property, and you're building a new office building, and you don't necessarily, there's not an appraiser coming to this land and they're going to appraise the land. I mean, they're going to appraise the land, but there's no building on it yet. So they have to do like, how much is it going to cost to build this? So they base it on loan to cost. So the next thing I wanted to jump into was this term known as debt service coverage ratio, which is a huge term in the industry, usually abbreviated as DSCR. I'm not sure if you guys covered this necessarily in your terminology in Trainual, but I do think it's important to touch on, just because it is a very like you will need to know like the debt service coverage ratio. And last time I used like a little video on YouTube to kind of help explain it. Are you guys okay with me sharing a couple more like videos? Just it helps me to break it down, and sometimes I just don't do a very good job of explaining it. So if you guys are okay with that, I'm just going to show you guys a quick little video here after I get it pulled up. Okay, do you guys see it on your end? Okay, and let me know if you give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
The debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, is a simple way to analyze whether a company can adequately manage its borrowing costs. The ratio helps banks evaluate the creditworthiness of an organization that is applying for a loan. It also tips off investors to companies carrying a debt level that could be destructive. To find the ratio, start with the company's net operating income. Then divide this figure by its total debt service, which includes principal and interest payments, as well as any contributions to a sinking fund created to retire bonds ahead of schedule. The DSCR measures the cash flow available to service a company's debt. A number above 1 indicates a positive cash flow. Abner's Art Supplies has a net operating income of $500,000 per year. However, it owes $450,000 in principal from existing loans and another $100,000 in interest. Abner's Art Supplies has a debt service coverage ratio of $500,000 divided by $450,000 plus $100,000 equals 0.91. The retailer is actually taking in less money than it pays out to its creditors. Unless it can turn these numbers around, getting approved for new loans will likely be difficult. One of the DSCR's weaknesses is that net income can fluctuate from one year to another. However, its advantage over other ratios is that it looks at all the company's debt-related payments and therefore provides a more comprehensive gauge of its borrowing.
Okay. Does anybody remember, just based off that video, what the equation is to get a debt service coverage ratio?
Net operating income divided by debt service.
Correct. So they want to see, lenders want to know if you're going to be able to debt service this. So this is a huge number they look at. They look at your cash flow and they look at your debt, and they want to make sure that this is going to produce income in the end. So it's really important that, like, they're not looking for you to break even. They're not looking for you to get a debt service coverage ratio of 1. If you were at 1, they would not provide you the loan. They want to see anything usually above a 1.2 debt service coverage ratio. Sometimes it's a 1.25. So they want to make sure this debt service is 20% of the time. So that the number 1.2 or 1.25, just kind of keep that in your head as like that is like where lenders want to see at debt service. And this is just based on the cash flow coming in and then how much debt you have. So does anybody have kind of any questions around that? I know that's kind of a lot, like that video is moving really fast and kind of a lot coming at you at once, but for the most part, how are we feeling about that term? Good? You guys rock. This is still a term that I have to like kind of remind myself of, like how to calculate it, what it means, because again, this is a way that lenders determine how much they will lend to the borrower. Basically, yeah, it's the net cash flow of the property before debt payments for 1 year dividend by annual debt payments based on the loan you will take out on the property. So yeah, great job, guys. Okay, so the next term, I think you guys went over some of these in your training material, are third-party reports. Third-party reports are really important in any loan that you get. I'm trying to think if there's an example of one like you don't need a third party, but most of the time you always need to get these third-party reports to get a loan. So you say you're buying a apartment building and you're going to get a Freddie Mac loan, which is a government agency loan. They're going to require a phase 1, usually a zoning report, an appraisal, let's see here, an Alta survey, and sometimes there's some additional reports. But these reports basically tell the lender, for the appraisal, tells them how much the property is worth as is. Say they're doing construction on it. After they'll show how much the property is worth after the work has been done, what they think the value will be. So that's going to tell the lender the appraised value for the property. And remember, that's important because the value of the property can determine how much the loan amount, how much they're going to give for a loan amount, because that's based on the LTV. So they'll determine the loan amount sometimes depending on the appraised value. So if the appraised value comes in less than the purchase price, then your loan amount is going to change. So third parties are just really important because they're going to be required by the lender, and it just shows you anything that you should be kind of aware of. Maybe there's like an environmental issue where you're buying a piece of land, but there used to be a gas station there. That could cause some huge environmental issues. And the way they would determine if there is any environmental issues is through like an environmental report or a phase 1 report. And then a zoning report. So I'm just going to kind of go through the rest of the reports here, but a zoning report basically tells you, it lets the property owner know what and how they can build on their property, because the Planning and Zoning Resource Corporation issues certain property uses, property setbacks, heights, open spaces, and lot coverage. They'll designate spaces for where commercial real estate can be built and where residential can be built depending on the zoning of the county. And so that's another report that oftentimes will have to be produced. The phase one, like I mentioned, is an environmental report, and they just want to make sure there's no contaminants like a gas station or a laundromat that could cause some environmental issues. There is such thing called a phase two. And a phase two is if the phase one report comes back and it's not like, I've never seen this personally because it's not super common, but it can happen. But basically, if it were to come back showing something was an issue, they would be able to touch, like a phase one doesn't touch the soil, but a phase two would touch the soil. So they would like basically dig below the soil to figure out what the contaminants are. But again, not common. I haven't seen this yet. I'm sure I will eventually, but haven't seen it yet. So yeah, third-party reports, I would say, just as like a little kind of inside to like my role, third-party reports are really crucial for how long a loan will be open for. So our goal is to try to close loans as quickly as possible. Obviously, we want to be thorough with how we close our loans. We don't want to just like skip through important steps, but we want to try to get somebody, or we want to try to close on a property as quickly as we can. We don't want it to just drag out months and months and months. Well, third-party reports will take usually the longest to get. So you can order a third-party report, say today, usually it won't be produced until 3 to 4 weeks out. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're getting a loan, and like when you want to close on that loan, you have to keep in mind to order those reports as soon as possible, because that can drag out the closing process for a long time, just depending on the timeline of it, the cost, because when you order an appraisal report, so like the lender will order appraisal bids, and you'll get back like 3 or 4 options, and usually the more expensive options have the shorter timeline. So it's like 2 weeks, but like it's going to cost you way more. 3 weeks, it's kind of usually like in the middle, and then like 4 weeks to 5 weeks, it's going to be way cheaper. But you got to kind of keep that in mind with, well, I don't want to drag out this. Like if we need to close, say in 4 weeks, and the appraisal report won't come back until 5 or 6 weeks, you got to keep that in mind. You got to maybe look at the quicker option there. So that's just a little insider to kind of my role as far as me dealing with third-party reports. I also will call the appraisal company, and I'll call like the third or the phase one party, and I will usually check in to make sure they have the correct address to the property. I usually make sure that they have all of the information they'll need, because they usually need a purchase contract to show like where the property is, who's buying the property. They'll usually need to see, if it's like an apartment building, they'll need to see all the leases. And these reports that they produce are super lengthy, and like they go through so much detail, and they'll always require property inspection. So they will have to coordinate a time with the current property owner to come and do an inspection on site. So if it's an apartment complex, they'll have to notify some of the units so that the appraiser can come in and inspect the units. Say it's like a Dollar Tree or Dollar General or whatever. They'll have to notify the owner or the tenant in there that they're going to be coming to do an inspection on the property, and usually they take photos of the property, and these end up showing up on the report. So yeah, it's super important that they have all the information they need. If you can provide them with what we call comps, which are comparables, this is helpful for the appraisers to kind of get a feel for like what other properties that are similar to that property are valuing for, because we want to try to do our best to represent the client to make sure it gets appraised for a decent value. And appraisal reports are usually like, there is some science to it, but it honestly comes down to like the experience, and then also the opinion of the appraiser. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, so I'm not saying it's just an opinion that they just throw out there, but it's like calculated based on like, you know, their calculations, but there's also kind of a bias kind of on it, if that makes sense. So you can never be 100% confident that you're going to get the appraised value that you want, because it just depends on like who you get and how they appraise it and everything. So that is a rundown on third-party reports. Does anybody have any questions on that? Has anybody had like any experience with any third-party reports, or like your parents like buying residential's a little bit different, but they still do like appraisals? Has anybody like been around it, seen their parents have to like get an appraisal done or anything
An appraisal, yes.
for like residential?
Mhm.
I've also seen it. I think when we were buying our house, the
Right.
whole process behind it.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, learning like commercial is so much different than residential, but I mean, there's that similarity to it where it's like, oh, like, now, like, if I ever buy a house, then I can go and like, I kind of have this background knowledge of like what an appraisal kind of consists of, even though it's a little bit different, I still feel like it gives you kind of a general idea of the concept of it. Okay, so the next term I'm gonna go over, did you guys review certificate of occupancy? Rimsa, you want to give it a shot?
I don't remember much because I finished a lot. Certificate of occupancy, isn't it the one where it's like it shows like who is going to be like the like what is the kind of like you're acquiring, kind of like whether it's going to be like the property is going to be apartments or something like that. Is that the one?
Yeah, pretty similar. It's pretty close. Basically it's a document that's issued by the local zoning or building department. And it usually tells you that a home or property is suitable for the occupancy. So just tells you if it's suitable and what safety standards it needs to meet. And it's just a document, like you'll basically like a permit that shows that the correct property is suitable for that space. Okay, and then a sale leaseback. Who wants to give that one a shot?
I can go. So isn't it when the owner of the property sells their property to another person as a way to liquidate their asset, but then they lease it back from the person that they just sold it from?
Yeah, so correct. So there's gonna be like kind of three ways to look at, I don't know if you guys kind of caught on to that. There's like kind of three ways to look at it. There's like this idea of a sales leaseback. Wait, actually I'm jumping way ahead here. We're gonna go back to that. In real estate, a leaseback allows the owner occupant of a property to sell it to an investor, like you said, while continuing to occupy the property. So like you said, it helps you liquidate it. So in an example, you have a guy who's buying an automotive company, and he bought it 10 years back for $1 million, but he's trying to grow and he's wondering where he can get his money from. And so one of the options is he could sell it to an investor and still remain the tenant. And then the building, since that was 10 years ago, the building's now worth $2 million. So now he has $1 million of equity tied up in this building. So then he could sign a lease for 10 years for $50,000 and sells the building so he can get the cash equity in the building and start growing. So pretty simple concept there. Triple net lease, or you would see like an NNN lease. Tate, you want to give that one a shot?
Yes, I do. Let me search at my notes. So the NNN lease is where the tenant pays for all property expenses, so insurance, utilities, property taxes, etc.
Yep, correct. So I would like kind of, this term is referred to as triple net. You'll see this a lot. Like these are your CVSs, your like, well, they can be, they like CVS, you got like auto zones, different, like a Dollar General. These are often always triple net. So the tenant will pay for, like he said, the property taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance on all of the utilities. So they're kind of paying, the tenant is basically paying for it all. Then there's two other terms. This is what I was jumping ahead to earlier. There's two other terms that kind of relate to the same concept, but they're like opposite. So there's a modified gross lease and then there's a gross lease. Who wants to give those a shot? They're different than the triple net lease, but it's like the same concept of, it's kind of three different categories if you look at it that way.
Isn't modified gross lease where tenant and the owner, they half and half kind of like they pitch in for 50-50, and gross lease is where everything is paid by the landlords in this case rather than the tenants.
Yep, exactly. So modified gross lease, I mean, you can kind of see it in the words like modified, it's half and half or whatever, but it's where they share the operating expenses. So they might share the property taxes and some of the maintenance. And then you got your gross lease where it's like all covered by the landlord. And when you think about it, it's kind of like, well, why would you, like what makes you do like as a tenant, it'd be like, oh, the landlord's paying for all of it. Like that'd be kind of nice, right? But at the same time, then it's on their schedule. It's on their time if they want to fix it. Whereas like a triple net, you're paying for, if you were the tenant, you're paying for everything. So you're going to be more prone to do it quicker. And if you want to get things done, like you'll get it done quicker. If something's broken, like all those little things, like you factor into it, you're like, oh, I mean, I would say there's pros and cons to all of these, right? One may cost more, but you have more control over it. Whereas, for if the landlord is controls all the property expenses, who knows, if they're a good landlord, then great. But if they're not, like you could be put in a very sticky situation. So any questions around that? So, okay. Moving to the next term. There's individually metered and master metered. Did you guys go over this in Trainual? Anybody wanna?
I know
Yeah.
it's an option, or one of the terms. I haven't reviewed it yet, but I did hear it somewhere. So I'm gonna take a shot at it. I think it's something to do with like the energy rate. I might be totally wrong, but that's what from before when I heard it somewhere, I think that's what it refers to.
Yeah, I mean energy. So I think maybe what you're thinking about is like energy as in like power and electricity, but basically, if the property is individually metered, it means that the tenant will pay their own power and electricity. So specifically when you're thinking apartments, like they're going to pay for their own power and electricity, whereas like master metered is like where the landlord is responsible for paying the power and electricity. And it's hard to say like which one's better, but it's kind of the same thing where there's like more accountability when you do it yourself versus like the landlord's doing it, depending on who your landlord is and stuff. But just those are good terms to know, recognize, and understand. Okay, a unit mix. So a unit mix basically describes the layout of the unit in a commercial property. Usually this has to do with like apartments, but the lender will always ask, what is the unit mix? So you get an apartment and they're going to say, what is the unit mix? They want to know if it's a studio apartment, if they're bedrooms, if there's 2 bedrooms, like 1 bath, 2 baths, like they want to know the unit mix, and that'll be important in the loan process and the underwriting process. So that term unit mix, that's what it stands for. Then there's another term, broken condos. Broken condos, I don't think I've done a loan yet with like a condo loan, but it's just another term to kind of know and recognize. So when you're dealing with a condominium association, you have to remember that many times they're sold to an end user to buy and occupy, but oftentimes these condo subdivisions are like partially vacant and the investor decides to buy a bunch of units to lease. So this would be considered broken because only a portion were sold and the rest are leased out by a different owner. So it's broken because they're not all sold. It's like some of them are leased and some of them are sold. And this can the challenge for the lender here is to provide financing to the guy who owns the units and leases that he does not own, because there's some like if he does not have control, sorry, let me rephrase this. So since he does not have control, this possesses a risk to the lender if they ever have to take the properties back through a foreclosure. So it's just kind of this term again to describe how usually with condos, you're going to see this where there's some lease out and there's some sold, and it can be kind of an issue for lenders to have to deal with if they ever have to foreclose on a property. An office condo association, basically these are associations that are nonprofit corporations that govern planned communities, condos, and they're usually a combination of they're usually a combination of the two. So usually these can be like some non-residential uses and some residential uses. So sometimes I'll use these for like office spaces and whatnot. Just kind of another term that the property is managed under the association where they share a common area for expenses. I wouldn't say this is a super important term to know, just kind of something to keep in mind. An anchor tenant. Who wants to give a shot at what an anchor tenant is?
I can go. It's a for like a retail space, isn't it? Kind of the big name who attracts the majority of the customers. So like a Walmart or like a Costco.
Exactly. So they're going to attract a lot of the traffic through the area. You know, if you have a Costco somewhere, like that brings in hundreds of people. And so if you got a Costco right next to like this strip mall, Costco would be considered your anchor tenant because it's just bringing in a lot of people, and it keeps the kind of the area moving, and you're more likely to get more business at like a strip mall next to a Costco versus like a strip mall that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. Okay, single use, or sometimes it's called special use properties. Tate, want to give that one a shot?
Yeah. So I have heard that properties that are difficult to use for other than what it's built for, so like gas stations, you can't really have anything but a gas station there. I'm trying to think of something else. Or I think the example in the video was a car wash. Like it's hard to have anything but a car wash company at a car wash.
Yep. The example in the video was a car wash. It's difficult to lease a car wash out to anyone else. If like a car wash, you know, if it closed, it's hard to like lease that out. So just this term single use or special use property kind of describes those properties that are like single use, like you really can only use it for this one category. Like some more examples would be hotels, gas stations, surgery centers, restaurants. That's kind of the main, or like a laundromat. Very, very specific. It kind of, the reason it is like a term in the industry is because it can pose like a tremendous risk to the lender. If you know, if they needed to sell it or whatever, and it's single use, so it's more risky. Okay. Another big term in the industry that you'll hear a lot of is a cap rate or a capitalization rate. I would love to hear from you guys if you guys have ever heard of capitalization rates. I mean, I don't know if it was I think it was in Trainual, but maybe it wasn't. Was it? Okay. It was in Trainual. Then who wants to try to explain this one?
I can give it a shot. So I had it written down that it was used in commercial real estate to indicate the rate of return that's expected. So say you're buying like a complex of apartments or condominiums, whatever it is that you're renting out or having like lessees for, the expected rate of return that you're going to get from having, you know, X amount of units occupied over X amount of time, kind of what that number would be.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of another term that I'm going to show like a little video for you guys, just as another way to explain it and to understand it. Maybe it'll like help you just kind of grasp this term a little bit more, because this is one of those terms that you'll see come up all the time. And it's really important to just like understand it. So let me pull that video up a second. Okay, do you guys see this? Yes, okay. Give me a thumbs up again if you can hear it.
One of the most popular tools investors use to determine price and value is the capitalization rate, or commonly referred to as cap rate. In short, the cap rate is the relationship between the annual net operating income, NOI, a property produces, and the price of the property. Let's quickly talk about NOI. The NOI is the income remaining after all taxes, insurance, and operating expenses are paid. Example, a property owner collects all the rents each month and then pays taxes, insurance, and expenses associated with owning the property. The income remaining is the NOI for that month. To determine the cap rate, you use the annual NOI. Now, for example, if the annual NOI of a property is $60,000 and the price of the property is $1 million, the math would look like this. The annual net operating income of $60,000 divided by the $1 million price of the property equals a cap rate of 0.06, so cap rate is 6%. The cap rate can be a personal decision for investors as it represents their belief of the risk of owning the property. Using the example above, except now we'll use a 7% cap rate. How much will an investor pay? Approximately $857,000. How do we get this? Take the NOI of $60,000 divided by a cap rate of 0.07 and it equals $857,142, rounded to $857,000. Remember, lower cap rate, higher price. Higher cap rate, lower price. Now you're on your way to becoming an investment property expert.
Okay. So hopefully that helped you out a little bit. One thing I wanted to highlight that's kind of helped me like understand this term is to like, I wouldn't necessarily say a 1% cap rate or like a 6% cap rate. Like there's a good and bad. It's all circumstantial and just depends on what you are wanting to purchase and, you know, what the lender is willing to lend. And so there's not a good or bad cap rate per se, but it is important to note that when you have a lower cap rate, so you have like a 3% cap rate, typically this is less risky of a purchase. So if you're coming from the standpoint of a borrower, so you have a lower cap rate, it's going to be less risky, but usually you have a lower rate of return on the investment. On the contrary, if you have a higher cap rate, so like say like you have an 8% cap rate, usually it tends to be more risky, but usually there's a higher rate of return on it. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about cap rates. And I wouldn't say try to look at it as like good or bad, but like more on the risky or less risky when thinking about it. Does that make sense to you guys? You guys are a smart group. Awesome. So kind of a brief overview of cap rate. I know in the video, I think Dave went into a lot more of the calculation, like giving different scenarios and explaining those. So I would highly recommend, like, if you're still kind of just trying to grasp this concept, kind of rewatch that video a couple times, because I think the more you do it, the more you'll understand the different scenarios he's explaining in there. And it'll just help you kind of understand it a little bit better. Another term, this is a really just broad term, but occupancy. So when you're looking at an investment property, so an investment property would include apartment, office, retail, industrial, where there are tenants that occupy the building. They want to know the percentage that the building is occupied. just another term that they'll always ask for. Okay, so that kind of covers the asset portions of the terminology, because I know it was kind of broken down to lenders and then assets. There was a little section on CMBS. I know the CMBS kind of, that loan is a little bit of a nuance and kind of foreign language to some of us that may not understand it, including myself. Sometimes it still confuses me. So I'm learning it just as much as you guys are. But a term you'll hear in CMBS loans is a standard carve-out provision. So this is tied to that concept of a non-recourse loan, which we learned about in another lesson. Rimsa, I know you know this. What is a non-recourse loan?
Recourse?
Non-recourse.
Non-recourse is the one where your personal property is not tied, your personal anything is not tied up with the loan.
Correct. So keep that in mind. It's not, you're not tied to anything, right? There's no personal like guarantee on it. So this term carve out provision is tied with CMBS loans, and it means that yes, there's no guarantee, there's no personal guarantee, but if something bad happens, then they could go after you personally. And the things that would qualify for if something bad happens would be like fraud, filing for bankruptcy, dumping waste on the property. These would be like actions that would cause them to go after you personally. And this would be considered a standard carve out. So it still is non-recourse, but if these things happen, then they could go after you. Okay. CMBS, how did those did you guys have to make kind of a diagram for that? And I think it was lesson 2 where you guys had to kind of explain it in your own words and stuff. How did you guys feel after doing that? Did it help you understand it more? Did it make you more confused?
Felt like it was pretty good to visualize. At least kind of what my understanding was it. And then after making the diagram, I feel like it just reaffirmed more what my understanding was. Not that my understanding was correct or incorrect, but it helped like make it feel like it's easier to know, I guess.
Well, yeah, when you can kind of put like pictures to it and like kind of get your thoughts out on paper, it helps you be like, okay, this makes more sense. Even though you're kind of like, is this correct? Like, I don't know if I actually did this right, but you're still kind of grasping this concept and you're kind of learning from your mistakes, right? You'll kind of like, the more you get into it, it'll be like, oh, that maybe this wasn't exactly correct, but at least you're still kind of shaping your understanding of it. So who wants to be bold and kind of in your own words explain what a CMBS loan is and what it stands for?
I can go. Just kind of a shot, but CMBS stands for commercial market backed securities. And it's essentially like a company like a Merrill Lynch will give you a loan for a property. And then after they've given you that loan, they will combine several loans that have the same risk level and are about the same amount and put them in what are called tranches. And that tranche is like a group of the same loans, like I said. And then investors will buy that tranche from like a Merrill Lynch, and the investor is usually like a life insurance group. And then you end up making the payments as like a borrower to that like life insurance group.
Yeah, that was a great kind of way to explain that and summarize that. And just to clarify, commercial mortgage-backed securities.
Mortgage.
Some things to kind of keep in mind with CMBS, because typically certain types of loans will have specific like terms and whatnot. So specifically for CMBS, this is a non-recourse loan. They usually provide loans from the sizes of like 3 million to 200 million or higher. They're usually fixed rates for about 7 to 10 years with 30-year amortization. And they do not provide loans for construction projects or any like improvements on properties, but they are only for like stabilized properties looking for like long-term fixed rates. They usually have a very strict prepayment penalty. And they can be good loans for clients who are looking to like maximize the leverage, or they need something a little outside the box. So I would say like, that's kind of a lot to remember about a CMBS loan. Like, oh man, like 7 to 10 years, and like, how am I supposed to remember all this? And that just kind of comes with time. And, when you're in the industry, you'll kind of have like your cheat sheet where you can look at and like, okay, these are the different types of loans, but like, let's get a good understanding of how each loan will look different. And then kind of refer back to it. And the more you do it, you'll just know it off like the back of your hand. Okay, so that kind of covers my CMBS notes for now. I'm just gonna kind of jump ahead to the last few just to we only got 8 minutes here. There was a legal opinion letter. This is usually a term that is used to refer to a document containing a lawyer's understanding of the law that applies to a particular case. Opinion letters are usually drafted at a client's request. And it's usually when someone is using an entity to buy a property, they need to have a third party that's local to the state that they're filing with to review and to give an opinion of the entity documents. I'm seeing this right now in one of my loans. They need a legal opinion. So the borrower has a legal party that they are paying for that will review their organizational documents like articles of incorporation and articles of corporation, and like all of those documents that certify that this is an entity. They'll review those. They can be kind of expensive and usually are utilized by CMBS lenders. So kind of just another term to keep in mind. And then the last kind of section I wanted to cover was this term known as an sorry, losing my spot. An easement. Does anybody know what like an easement is? No? That's okay if nobody does. Okay, so a property easement is a legal situation in which the title to a specific piece of land remains with the landowner, but another person or organization is given the right to use that land for a distinct purpose. So, for example, a utility company may have an easement that allows them to access to an electrical pole on your property. Or you could have an easement on part of your property if it blocks access to a main road. So according to the Legal Information Institute, a property covenant is an agreement between two or more parties regarding certain use of piece of real estate property. So if something were like hanging over onto your property, you would need to make sure like you have the legal documents to say like what parts of their property belong to which party, because sometimes there's like a property line, and if you have like an overhang going over somebody else's property, you need to know like what is technically your property and what's not, because it can cause some issues down the road if you don't have those like properties zoned out correctly. That's where like when you get an Alta survey, which is like a survey of the property, you'll get like a map basically where it shows like all of the street addresses and then like the size of the property, and it's basically like looks like a blueprint of your property, and that basically shows like your legally how large your property is, where it cuts off, and like where there may be some easements and whatnot. So another term. I'm gonna wrap it up there with terminology, but if you guys have any other questions, again, feel free to email me, or in your next meeting with Tom, if you want to touch on those, don't be afraid to ask. I know some of you are still finishing up some of those terms, but just remember terminology is this is kind of your introduction into the commercial real estate world. There's lots of terms in here, and they're just important to recognize, introduce to yourself, so that when you hear them, it just starts to become like it just becomes your normal verbiage during the day. But next week, Wednesday, or this week, Wednesday, you guys will be starting on, I'm gonna go to Trainual a second to make sure I have the correct information.